Previously on Drone Wars.
If you are the commander of the surge in Iraq or coalition forces in Afghanistan, you have got to get the big ideas right.
This is it. I know this is the answer. This is what I think I need to be focused in on to then create the outputs necessary.
This idea of big ideas is the big idea. It is all about big ideas. It's true in all aspects of life, by the way. There was a full colonel intelligence officer who had been thrown out of Iraq, literally sent back home in the first year because he said we were facing an insurgency, which is what we were facing, but those in the Pentagon did not want to hear it. Hi, I'm retired General Dave Petraeus, and you're watching the Drone Wars podcast.
I wanted to ask you about how information is processed and how people in a position at the top receive and then push out plans.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a nice transition to the conversation
Sure.
in Ukraine, because we almost have sensory overload with the amount of information, right? You talk to Ukrainians, they're fighting the whole war on WhatsApp. They've built single planes of glass where they can say, I need to see in this quadrant of the battlefield every single unmanned asset and manned asset I have. And it's almost democratized, right?
Well, we sort of had the same. The way to describe the way information should be disseminated that is generally flat.
Yep.
In fact, I would, during the course of a day, there would be SIGACs, they were called, significant activities, that literally pop up on your laptop. I had a laptop wherever I was, unless I was actually on the ground on patrol. There's a laptop in my armored vehicle, laptop in the helicopter, laptop on the plane, and we had communicators constantly there. We're constantly in communication. And they just hand me the classified laptop and the unclassified back and forth, and would work through that all the time. And you'd see pop up significant activities reports, which popped up for everyone. So you talk about democratization of reporting, there it is. And many reports would be that way. That doesn't mean that units didn't submit daily situation updates, that I wouldn't get weekly updates, for example, from the Joint Special Operations Command, on what they had done that week, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of that. But a lot of this, it's going to everyone. It's unprocessed. It's the first report. And then, of course, you dig into it, and there are updates that come out as you go along. By the way, this is particularly, in a way, challenging when I was a commander in Afghanistan, because our son was a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader in an airborne brigade in a very tough area, combat outpost Syedabad, southwest of Kabul. And quite often they would get into firefights, and it wasn't for a number of hours until he could get back and get on a SIPRnet, secure internet, and say, hey, just wanted to let you know I had a little dust up today. Everything's fine. So that, that was reassuring, because I tried to stay away. I never met with him my entire tour, until he was out of combat, actually, where they'd already done the right seat, left seat ride. His successors were in charge, and they're literally sitting at the airport waiting for the aircraft to take them up to Kyrgyzstan, the first stop of their redeployment.
Yeah.
So that's how that worked. But now going back down, the issuance of orders, that has to be hierarchical, because each level is going to take what I've provided and then make it into an order appropriate for their organization. And there's all kinds of different organizations out there. There's not just the multinational core, the operational ground force commander, if you will. There's the special mission unit commander, 3-star. There's the Corps of Engineers, 2-star. There's a detainee operations, 2-star. There's the list just goes on and on. The train and equip mission was a 3-star. There were SOF. There were all those organizations, and I had a battle rhythm for how often I would meet with them. The 3-star and the train and equip mission, I met once a week for at least an hour a week. And there was a rolling rhythm to what it is that we actually did. 1 week, the first week, it might be the Iraqi military. The second week might be the Iraqi police. Third week might be the other Ministry of Defense elements. Final week might be the other Ministry of Interior elements. So, and then repeat the process. But so again, this is all part of that battle rhythm. But to go back to where you started, assimilating, processing, marinating in information is the name of the game. It all starts with that. Because if you don't get that right, you won't understand the situation sufficiently to craft the right big ideas, to craft the right strategy. And by the way, we've had pretty big mistakes over the years in our history. It took us 13 years in Vietnam to get the big ideas right. And by the time we did, late 1968, the Tet Offensive had already occurred, and it undermined any perception of progress, and the war was lost for all intent and purposes in the United States homeland. Continued for many more years, but the opportunity had been lost. The French never got the big ideas right in Vietnam and Indochina in their day, and Dien Bien Phu, where they tried to entice the enemy to attack them, thinking they could then slaughter the enemy. They put this outpost at the edge of their air cover in the valley at Dien Bien Phu, never thinking that North Vietnamese could get the howitzers up on the hills. Colossal mistake, and eventually had to surrender. So again, the big ideas, this all briefs well, but it's pretty hard to do it and to keep it right. Kodak, for example, was the king of film and photography services, had 2,000 patents on digital photography, failed to make digital photography the new big idea. Others got there first, and they never have been the same since then. So it's a rare firm such as Amazon or Netflix, Alibaba, that get the big ideas right time after time after time. For what it's worth, I'd submit that KKR has done that really impressively over the years. In fact, when I joined KKR, we had only $83 billion under management. We now have 665, and it's climbing rapidly. We're no longer just private equity. We own an entire insurance company. We have of 200 billion under management. We have private credit, believe it or not, just like banks, because they stopped lending in the Great Recession. Nearly 200 billion. We also do infrastructure, energy, real estate, growth tech, strategic investing, impact, all these others. And those are all a result of this process of finding new big ideas and refining the existing ones. But it's rare to see a company that can continue to do that for decades and decades. And that requires really good strategic leadership.
So let's talk about KKR for a second, right? How are you guys viewing the changes in defense, and how are you guys investing against that?
Well, we do invest in defense. We carved out Hensoldt, which was Airbus Electronics. We took private the largest space company in Europe, OHB. We have a number of other in sort of niche areas that make, specialized valves or the components of major end items and that kind of stuff. And they have all been quite successful. We believe that this is going to be an area of considerable opportunity, particularly when it comes to NATO, which of course has just increased the standard for spending on defense from 2% of GDP to 3.5%, and then another 1.5% that will be on related industries, investments, infrastructure, and so forth to facilitate the implementation of the new strategy put out by the Supreme Allied Commander about a year or so ago. Germany in particular is going to spend anywhere from 600 billion to a trillion additional euros over a decade or so. It's obviously the biggest economy in Europe. So again, lots of opportunities there. The US defense budget with the additional 150 billion added to the base budget of 850 will take it to $1 trillion for the first time. Japan has is in the process of doubling its defense spending in a 5-year period, et cetera, et cetera. So you can walk the world. This is what we do. Understand very granularly the major changes in the context, in the overall global economy. And then you develop investment themes, and I'm one of the keepers of the investment themes. And that then guides the deal teams to look in the right places for the right deal. keeping in mind that then when you get to that level, it's no longer macro, now it's micro. Every deal is micro. And of course, it's compared to what or whom, whatever the competition is in that sector, and trying to make a judgment as to how successful we can make that company if we buy it or if we are a lead investor in it.
So when you look at the conflict in Ukraine, right? Are there some new themes that have emerged out of there?
Oh, big time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the themes there is that, particularly for large conventional wars, and I mean, part of it is just that there still can be large conventional wars. I think there was some disbelief about that, but particularly in that kind of context, that we all need to shift, as Ukraine has, and as Russia has too, by the way. They're both innovating very rapidly from a large number of heavily manned, often very capable, very expensive platforms that are increasingly vulnerable. At sea, it's almost any major combatant vessel, certainly aircraft carriers and the elements in their task force, but it's main aircraft, it's tanks, so forth. They are so increasingly vulnerable to unmanned systems that you need to shift part of your force structure, at least, from that traditional component of large manned platforms to an incredible number, a vast number of unmanned systems under the sea, on the surface, in the air, on the ground, in outer space, in cyberspace, even in the cognitive space, if you will. The reference to efforts by both sides to persuade populations, essentially Russia in particular, are using propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, and so on, in any platform where that will resonate. So it's in social media, it's in traditional media, it's in 24-hour news, it's whatever it is that can be influenced to try to influence perceptions on one side or the other that the war is lost or the war is won or what have you. All of that, and by the way, increasingly, remotely piloted systems are going to give way to algorithmically piloted systems. I have gone to Ukraine repeatedly over the years. In fact, the very first time I was there, it was still the Ukrainian Republic of the USSR, Soviet Republic. And in fact, I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army. It was the first visit by a Chief of Staff to the Soviet Union since George C. Marshall went to Yalta in 1944. So it was very historic as well.
Wow.
In fact, when we touched down in Kyiv, the greeter at the foot of the aircraft stairs was Marshal Gromov, who was the last man out of Afghanistan when the Russians withdrew from that conflict. And you may recall the scene, his son jumped into his arms as he walked across so-called Freedom Bridge. And since February 2022 and the full-on invasion by Russia, I've been there 6 times. Every time I go to see the Nemesis, originally battalion, now regiment, and the latest innovations that they are carrying out, and they're just breathtaking. And their description of what's going on, again, is just, it's truly extraordinary. Tanks and armored personnel carriers cannot survive on the front lines anymore. The Russians have given up on using combined arms operations now because of the dramatic increase in the number of drones that can knock them out in one way or another. So the Russians are reduced to essentially infantry soldiers racing across the street from one building to another if they're in an urban setting, trying to establish a new foothold and fight it out, or from one windbreak to another, as they're termed, or tree line to another. There's just very incremental movement on a daily basis. Typically, every now and then there's a bit of a breakthrough, or the surprise attack by the Ukrainians into Kursk province of Russia was quite notable. But generally, if it's an area where there's constant surveillance by drones, and it is 24/7 surveillance, the minute the attacker emerges, immediately the suicide drones are popped up and they go after them. And the pilots of these are spectacular. The Russians are very good at jamming, electronic warfare, denying access to the normal command and control link, to GPS, to Starlink, to whatever. So there now are 4 antennas on the Ukrainian drones, which are very cheap compared with what we produce, but very effective, much more effective, frankly, because they're iterating constantly. They have a procurement process in which the individuals who design the drones, those who employ them, and those who manufacture them is just like this. And they're constantly updating, unlike our process, where, every time you change something, you have to issue a change order, and then they sue you and all the rest of this. So it's quite extraordinary to see what they have done. They've conducted the only unmanned systems attack, which had all remotely driven vehicles, remotely operated machine guns, and remotely piloted drones of all types, some suicide, some surveillance, some longer range, some they're actually mini bombers and so forth. At sea, the Ukrainians really don't have a navy, and yet they've sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet using aerial drones and intelligence to find the ships, and then maritime drones that blow them up. There are maritime drones that can launch air defense missiles. They took down 2 frontline Russian fighters over occupied Crimea a couple of months ago. And then, of course, you had this spectacular Operation Spiderweb, where trucks drove into Russia with drones in their roof. Once they were positioned near strategic airfields in Russia, some that were thousands of kilometers apart, they simultaneously launched an attack of about $1 million worth of drones that damaged or destroyed about $7 billion worth of Russian strategic aircraft. So again, the unmanned system, the Ukrainians don't just have an Army, Navy, Air Force, they have also an unmanned systems force. It keeps growing. Every infantry company now has a drone platoon. Every battalion has a drone company. Every brigade has a drone battalion, and so forth. And then there are all these independent units like the Nemesis Regiment, which is responsible for a certain portion of the front lines. It has its counterparts also. And by the way, it's all gamified. You can see on your cell phone where they stack up against the others, because you get a certain amount of points for a tank, more points for self-propelled artillery than towed artillery, infantry, et cetera. They tweaked it to give more points for infantry because that has turned out to be now the maneuver element of choice, basically individual soldiers. So all of this truly remarkable. They are racing ahead in terms of innovation, leaps and bounds, and we are not. Our military industrial congressional complex has vested interests in existing systems, platforms, basing arrangements, maintenance contract, you name it. And it's very, very hard to innovate at the speed that we should if you have that kind of system, which generally, I think it's not inaccurate to say, it's a bit simplified, but it's not inaccurate to say that our system is producing yesterday's technology for tomorrow's wars. The Ukrainian system is producing tomorrow's technology for today's wars. And we need to learn a great deal from what it is they're doing, how they're doing it, because it is drones that are making a huge difference in this war, as long as Ukraine can continue to defend itself against the missiles and drones that are coming from Russia strategically every night. And I'm very concerned by the reports that we may be cutting off U.S. supply of Patriot, the missile interceptors, because of shortages. That would be very short-sighted in my view.
Drone Wars is recorded from Firestorm's global headquarters in San Diego, California. Each week on the podcast, we bring you cutting-edge insights from unmanned industry leaders. Listen as they share the breakthroughs and technologies they're working on, the hard lessons they've learned, and the bold predictions about what the next 5 to 10 years in unmanned systems and advanced manufacturing have in store for us. Enjoying the show so far? Then be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now back to the show. Okay, a lot to unpack there, right? Let me just ask you, like, at a very high level question here, right? And this is probably more of a tactic, right? Would you be investing more in defensive autonomous systems, right? Or would you be building a larger hedge to basically dissuade that attack Or is it a combination of both? You know what I mean? I mean, how do you think through that?
Yeah, no, I think it's probably a combination of both, but you definitely, I think what we have seen in Ukraine and also, by the way, in the war between Israel and Iran,
Yep.
is that counter drone operations, anti-ballistic missile, and anti-aircraft have to be beefed up wherever it is that you are. In fact, there was a tragic loss of 2 Americans at a little outpost in Jordan, of all things. It's very close to both Iraq and Syria. It's an area, and part of it was just confusion about thought that it was a friendly drone versus enemy. But again, it really highlighted that we've got to do a lot better about protecting our bases, infrastructure, and frankly, in the U.S. itself. I think there will come a time when we're going to have to surround stadiums, major facilities, government headquarters, and so forth, with much, much more in terms of counter drone operations that possibly not only alert you to them, but can shoot them down either with a mix of high powered microwave, lasers now are starting to come into their own, maybe even Iron Dome, but that's, again, it's $50,000 an interceptor, and it's also, that's a munition. And something's going to come down somewhere as a result of that. Now that can happen with hyper microwave and laser as well. But again, I think the whole area of anti-missile defense, anti-drone defense, anti-rocket defense, all of this has to be beefed up very considerably. And then you have to have the drones that can perform the functions that they're doing in Ukraine in particular. And the Russians are doing the same thing. Sometimes they're a little ahead. There's even an innovation now because of the jamming that the Ukrainian drones and some Russian drones are spooling out little fiber optic cable behind them. And this is mass produced. You can only imagine all the sort of fishing line type of residue that's going to be there from these.
Have you seen those pictures of the forests that have just fibers across all the tree tops? It's incredible.
There are entire stretches of road from rear to front on both sides that have mesh netting above them, connected to the trees on either side, to try to prevent drones from hitting convoys going to and from the front lines. And then there are, of course, videos of drones that are actually finding a way through the trees underneath that to hit the Russian vehicles in particular. So all of this, clearly, there has to be more emphasis. We saw with Israel, if they hadn't had the interceptors, the damage would have been even greater than it was. Now, they didn't lose huge amounts of lives. 30 is a terrible number, a tragedy for a small country, but it would have been much, much worse if they hadn't either shot down over 90%, or actually in that 90% are those that they didn't bother to shoot down because they were clearly headed for the open desert or some area that was not heavily populated. So I think that's something you have to have. If you shift to an Indo-Pacific theater, our Indo-Pacific commander, Admiral Paparo, has said publicly he wants to create a hellscape. He wants to turn the Taiwan Strait, 110 miles of open water, into a hellscape if China tries to invade Taiwan. And that would be with unmanned systems under the water, on the water, in the air, on the ground, again, space, cyberspace, again, the cognitive space, etc. And you can imagine the numbers. By the way, the last time I was in Ukraine about 2 months ago, I asked the commander of Ukrainian forces, how many drones did you throw at the enemy yesterday, or employ it all said. And he said something like 7,000. Just let that sink in. That means you have to produce over 3 million or so. You do the math, and they are. So this is a very, very different, this is the future of war right there. And we need to adapt and innovate much more rapidly than we are.
Do you think that the US DoD understands just the actual volume of drones we're going to need here?
I think again, keep in mind that the money goes to the services, not to the Secretary of Defense. He gets a lot of money, but it's for his activities at his level.
Yeah.
A lot of individual DARPA, Defense Innovation Unit, all those. But the big money is to the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. and now Space Force, and actually SOCOM, which for this purpose is essentially a service-like entity. And they do understand, I think, the changing dynamics of warfare and what the future of war will be like. But they're having to contend with these impediments, which are in every element, again, of the military, industrial, congressional complex.
Right.
You're well aware that there used to be members of Congress that kept the Air Force having to buy a certain type of aircraft way beyond they wanted anymore. They said, we have more than enough of these tactical transport aircraft. But for many, many years, they were forced to continue to buy more of them. So there's lots of that goes on as individual members of the House, individual senators of states, and sometimes other advocates for a certain platform, base, weapons system, you name it, intervene. And that's what makes it very difficult to rapidly evolve to what should be the future of warfare. That doesn't mean that carrier task forces won't be useful anymore, or that manned bombers won't still have a very important role, et cetera. We've seen that they do, depending on the circumstances. But for many of the contexts of the future, what we will see is much more what we see in Ukraine than, say, what we have seen even in the Middle East.
So, General, last question here, right? Where do you think warfare goes in the next, let's call it 12 to 24 months, right? It's probably a little easier to project out.
Frankly, it depends on how well we do ensuring that the elements of deterrence in critical theaters are solid. Keep in mind that deterrence is a function of a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and we need to transform those more rapidly, and your willingness to employ them on the other hand. And frankly, what you do elsewhere can influence perceptions in, say, the Indo-Pacific region, where we want every day the leader to wake up in Beijing and say, boy, that's the only thing left on my bucket list. I've done Hong Kong, Tibet, Uyghurs, Xinjiang, Macau, reunification, but okay, not today. And that's every day you want that conclusion to be reached because you have very, very capable forces and a clear willingness to use them without being needlessly provocative. So you don't want to provoke a war, you want to prevent it. And the way to do that is with the elements of deterrence being rock solid. But you should keep in mind that if you don't support Ukraine in the way that we should, a fellow democracy, however imperfect, believes in free market economics, the freedoms that we enjoy, again, imperfect, but so are all other democracies around the world to varying degrees. If you don't support them, that sends a message that you may not be willing to support Taiwan in its hour of need. If you don't do what is necessary in the Middle East to support Israel and our friends and partners there, the Gulf states, again, that sends a message. I remember when there was a red line on Syrian use of chemical weapons. Yep. It was crossed, and it turned out not to be a red line. And I was literally in the office of the Prime Minister of Singapore at the time, and he said, General, that has repercussions out here. There are reverberations out here, and you should keep that in mind. So that's why I say it depends on what we do around the world, and then specifically, what do we do in the most important mission of the U.S. military and our coalition partners and allies in the region, and that is to ensure deterrence in the Indo-Pacific theater in particular.
What does deterrence in Indo-PACOM look like to you?
Well, I think there are several elements of this. There's that component, which is in a sense by itself a bit, and that's on the Korean Peninsula, obviously, South Korea and the coalition and the U.S. deterring North Korea. And I think that is probably pretty solid. There are some other areas where we help host nations deal with threats, some of which involves a degree of deterrence. But the real big issue, the real mission, of course, is the overall whole of government's approach, but founded on the military in particular, to ensure that there is not the kind of manifestation of military operations that ends up with the U.S. and China, the two biggest economies in the world, not just competing, severe competition, as our former national security advisor used to define the relationship, but actually military confrontation. And everyone loses in that. The global economy sustains enormous damage. And that's what has to be prevented. And that's why deterrence in that regard, in that theater, is so vitally important. I think those in the Pentagon get this without question. The question is if they realize as well that what you do in other parts of the world influences perceptions in the Indo-Pacific and thereby either strengthens deterrence or undermines it.
Thank you so much for taking some time today to talk to us, General. It was really fascinating.
Be with you, Dan. Thanks. I'm a huge fan of your podcast and what you're doing, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you.
Thanks for listening to the Drone Wars podcast. Each week, we bring you fascinating conversations with leaders shaping the future of air, sea, land, and space technologies. Catch new episodes wherever podcasts can be found. Until then, we'll see you next time.